Hi, everybody. Welcome to Never Is Now and this particular workshop. We really are excited that you all have decided to spend time with us. And on this topic of extremism in the election, what now? I think that's a question that a lot of people have on their mind. We kind of figured people would have it on their mind, even as we developed this idea before today. So, in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, us at ADL, and in particular at the Center on Extremism, we have tracked inflammatory rhetoric and conspiracy theories, disinformation, politically charged street violence, and a lot of that discussion that extremists have been both online and seeing how that animates and impacts people, motivates them to carry out activity in the real world. These extremists have leveraged events throughout the entire year, whether it was a gun rights rally in Virginia, reopened protests after the pandemic started, social justice protests, and now. And one of the things that is critical to understand is that these efforts to track the extremist activity are only made more impactful if we're looking at the data. Understanding these threats is important, but ultimately resourcing to these threats, working to prevent them, is what is most important. And so while we have not gotten through the election, well, now that we have gone through the election, the importance of tracking this extremist-related data remains even more critical. And I don't mean just for the next 60 days, not just for the next couple months, but moving forward indefinitely. The ideas and the messages and the impact of extremism, require a long game, not just a short game. So I am super excited because we understand that in order to identify what we need to look for in the future is investing in people doing that data research today. And we have an incredible panel of people who are bringing their expertise and their data collection to these issues. Again, this is important because the plots of tomorrow are being hatched today. And I'm excited to introduce you to folks who I know are actually working to combat that threat. So today, and you will be able to read their full bios on our website, we have a panel of 3 people doing this great work. First is Shannon Hiller, co-director of the Bridging Divides initiative. Then we have Hampton Stahl, who created the Militia Watch, and also Vidya Ramalingam, the founder of Moonshot. So each one is going to spend about 5 to 7 minutes to talk about what they've been working on, demonstrate a little bit about how data has impacted their work, and then we're going to take some questions and have a discussion amongst ourselves. So thank you again for joining us. And Shannon, please take it away.
Thanks, Oren. I really appreciate that introduction. And you hit the nail on the head. It's about how this data informs individual action. And so that's something we really focus on at BDI, at Princeton, where we want to make sure that the data that we're working with and the best practices that we're sharing are to inform community resilience, specifically with a focus around this election. And so I'll talk briefly about some national trends that we were able to highlight, but also what that looks like at the county level and incident-specific level. And I think, again, most importantly, how we actually work to get that data and analysis into the hands of folks for planning and action. And so on the next slide, given that we want to also leave time for questions, you'll see some of the national trends. And so ahead of the election, we knew we wanted to partner with an organization called ACLID to do this US Crisis Monitor that tracks not just extremism, but a broad range of peaceful political activity and other types of contentious political violence. And so the good news message up front is that throughout the summer, the vast majority of activity was peaceful. Well over 95% of all demonstrations were peaceful through the summer. You see that dropped off at the end of June. And so on the next slide, you can see confirmation that that peaceful trend continued through to the election. And so even though there were spikes in mobilization around particular national issues, and then as we looked locally around other local issues, we still saw that low level of overall contention, which is anything from arrests to more specific extremist threats and activity around demonstrations. In order to dig into those specific threats, we'll look at that blue line in more detail on the next slide. where we can pull out a couple of trends that we really worked ahead of the election together with ADL and others to make sure folks were aware of it in national trends. So one that you can see here is the green line around counter protests. So just noting that counter protests continued pretty consistently against peaceful demonstrations and others throughout this summer. You'll also see that purple line at the bottom, which is a combination of unlawful paramilitary, but also just any armed activity around demonstrations that indicate potentially increased risk of escalation. And so our data doesn't show it increasing, but still consistent through the summer. Then on the next slide is another one that I think is a great example of a national trend that we really work to highlight, both for community groups planning peaceful actions, but also for law enforcement and local officials who are looking at potential threats around long lines at polling places or demonstration and mobilization. The fact that the use of car rammings as weapons was something we saw consistently in the US Crisis Monitor data. And so even though it was a relatively low number after that initial spike at the end of May and early June, you can see that of all peaceful or demonstrations in general that met with some type of intervention, in some weeks that was even 1 in 10 involved a car ramming. So it was something folks could plan ahead of the election and plan specifically address in how they were thinking about the issues. So I think one of the most powerful things to do, and you can see on the next slide an example in Pennsylvania, is also bring this down to a really hyper-local level. A lot of what BDI does is make sure that this publicly available data from the US Crisis Monitor is combined with other types of resources, so you can both see specific incident data, but also see trends at sort of a sub-state or even a local level. So here, part of what you're seeing is that while Pennsylvania as a whole is below the national average on things like contentious demonstrations or counter-protests, those are really concentrated in particular counties through the summer. And so we've had discussions ahead of the election with folks preparing for the potential for counter-protests around polls or elsewhere, or thinking about where there might be an explicit militia threat. And that helps focus on specific counties where they want to reach out ahead of things like an election that could be more mobilizing, as well as have conversations at the local level. So on the next slide, you can see that kind of in a more graphic representation and combining a couple of different sources. So this shows Pennsylvania at the county level, all demonstrations since the end of May, just in a simple count, but also those individual incident dots are any militia or armed activity around demonstrations, as well as another data source we work with around vigilante activity from another researcher. So one reason why I highlight this map and example in Pennsylvania is it also tracks with a lot of more robust modeling we've done to bring in over a dozen different additional data sources, including drawing on ADL's heat map and some of the white supremacist activity and tracking in the past. And that map looks largely, even as this map does, so calling out areas where you can see in Philadelphia, or even Harrisburg, like we saw this past weekend, where there's been past demonstration and armed or militia activity in that particular location. So that gives us an indication of how we can plan together with a lot of our partners. And I think in a lot of cases have successfully planned together with our partners through this election in order to address those types of issues. And I think though the modeling we were able to do with the US Crisis Monitor data to date was initial, I think it showed a lot of promise in how we could prepare ahead of election day itself. But I'd be remiss if on the next slide I didn't highlight that we are still in the middle of the election itself. And so I think a lot of the points here is that a lot of hard work and the collaboration and partnership through election day helped us get a largely peaceful voting process, but we want that to continue through this period now. And so we're continuing to watch the ways in which that sort of modeling and details, it can inform the response already. And so on the next slide, I think you can see, what does this mean right now? A lot of that is continuing to exercise patience around this immediate post-voting period and be cautious of, I know a lot of the other panelists here are going to talk about inciting rhetoric and ways that bad actors can be mobilized, and that sort of reinforcing the integrity of the election is critical. I think there's also an opportunity to highlight stories of resilience. And that's where a lot of our work in talking about the threat matches with the community resilience piece. And so whether that's talking about where the Clark County clerk in Nevada was able to respond to the counter protest mid press conference and continue on with his press conference about election integrity, or whether that's some of the good work in foiling extremist threats against counting locations in Philadelphia. As Oren said, this work continues, and we've seen some successes to highlight. And then I think the last, and we can get into this, I'll look forward to this in the discussion, is really what have we learned through this election specifically about these types of threats, and what information was most critical to all of our partners in preparing. So thanks so much, and looking forward to everyone else's comments.
Great, thank you, Shannon. And Hampton from Militia Watch, you're up next.
All right, I'm gonna get the screen share going. All right, so my name is Hampton Stahl. As I've been introduced, I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Militia Watch. So I'm gonna be talking a little bit about armed right-wing movements, which is a sort of broader term than militias, and some of the work that I've been doing ahead of the election and post-election as well. So just a quick overview again. So Militia Watch is a project that I started a couple years ago in 2016 after 2 years of intensive research into militia groups, but based off of another 5 to 7 years of more casual watching. I'm also affiliated with ACLED, so that's the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project. Their US Crisis Monitor project launched at the beginning of the summer, and I did some militia data specific work there. I'm now a senior researcher there. I'm just settling into this role. And the US Crisis Monitor has a partner on this call in Bridging Divides Initiative. So very happy to be here in conversation. If any of you know me from before, which I don't expect anyone watching this broadcast to, it's probably through the report that I co-authored with 2 folks at ACLED, which was this risk assessment ahead of the election, looking specifically at right-wing militia and armed movements. We identified 5 high-risk states and 5 moderate high-risk states, and we discussed some of the history of that summer, as well as identified several key actors in these spaces. So we developed this big, huge chart of national actors. I'm gonna just remove it, the full thing from your screen so you're not reading it. But 2 of these actors here are ones that I want to focus in on specifically with the sort of period of time since the report came out, which was 3 weeks ago. So the Boogaloo Boys, as they're mentioned here, have been, in a lot of cases, highly demobilized from where they were when we wrote the report. There have been some major arrests of individuals. There have been major doxes of leaders. And even in the past week, they've sort of struggled to get numbers to turn out in some of the street protests. Whereas the Proud Boys have been highly active even in the last few days. So they're definitely still this very high potential, very high history group. So all the groups that we tracked in this report are different movements. They do have different sort of goals and ideologies, but they're highly aligned in sort of the endpoint that they're looking at around the election. All of these groups are highly responsive to the sort of political environment. We've been in sort of this period of really high energy in the sort of way that politics is being talked about and acted upon, which these guys are obviously responding to. So ACLED deals specifically with event data. So this is all drawn from event data and a little bit of more contextual knowledge. With Militia Watch, I often delve into networks, into ideology, into structures. So this is a network visualization that I worked on previously. This is drawn from 223 right-wing channels and their administrator, moderator teams. So the orange dots on this map, I know it's kind of small, but the orange dots here are individual accounts. The white dots are a series of different groups. So everything from Oath Keeper to local militia groups to Proud Boys to neo-Nazis to QAnon, you name it. The red ones are 3%ers, which is a specific militia group that was formed in 2009. So all of this is 223 channels that On the Media is Micah Lowinger and I put together a couple months ago. And when we see these network visualizations, we usually think it's something like Facebook, but in fact, this is on Zello, which is a walkie-talkie app that a lot of militia groups have become quite accustomed to using. We ended up sending this full list to the CEO of Zello, and most of these channels are still up. So it's not been a priority. Another thing that I like to look into is the sort of reality versus public narrative around a lot of militia groups. So this map right here is the counties that the New Mexico Civil Guard claimed to have a unit in. And New Mexico Civil Guard sort of made national news when a protester who was alongside them shot at a protester who was protesting against a statue in Albuquerque at the beginning of the summer. Diving into this group, their Facebook presence was a little bit more limited than what they claimed in their original muster call. So the black marked counties here are where they had a corresponding Facebook group. It's important to note that a Facebook group does not mean that there's actually a militia unit, and not having a Facebook group does not mean that there's not a militia unit. But if we dive a little bit further down into these groups, we can look at sort of the engagement that they've had with the public. So a lot of these groups, these pages, these Facebook pages have only had a few posts in their history. So this is at the start of June. This is what their stats looked like. Where some of them had 2 posts, 3 posts, 4 posts, and the highest amount of likes was under 300. So they did not have a massive presence online. And the group was definitely interested in sort of projecting power into a space that was not really necessarily super accurate as far as the numbers of the group actually goes. Now, this doesn't mean that small militia groups like the New Mexico Civil Guard are not often highly risky, and they do have a shooting tied to at least their periphery. So that's not the sort of narrative I'm trying to put here, but a lot of the groups do sort of base a lot of their power in the real world on how they're sort of analyzed in the media. They use this as a really important bit of PR for them, either saying that their size is really high or that they're more moderate than they actually are. As the press dove into the New Mexico Civil Guard, they exposed that the leader was a neo-Nazi before starting the group. So there's all kinds of stuff that press can illuminate if they know where to look. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion part of this. My name's Hampton again, and I run Militia Watch.
Thank you so much, Hampton. And last but certainly not least, Vidya is going to talk about some of the work that they're seeing at Moonshot.
Great. Thank you so much, Oren. And hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, ADL, for inviting me. My name is Vidya Ramalingam. I am co-founder of Moonshot, and we are an organization that uses technology to respond to violent extremism, to disinformation, and to a range of other online harms globally. And what do we do? I mean, what we do is we monitor and we build an evidence base around how these groups are operating online. But we also, and this is really our primary objective as an organization, we also work to directly interact with those audiences. We work to offer them safer alternatives online, to intervene online, and to de-escalate users from violence. And I'll touch on some of that work towards the end of my presentation, but some of you might be aware of our partnership with ADL last year to deliver the redirect method campaigns repurposing advertising technology to reach audiences at risk of white supremacy across the US. The results of those campaigns have been published and are available online, but that's just one of the ways that we reach some of these users. The first step before we interact with any audience that's engaging with violent or harmful content online, our first step is always to build an evidence base around how they operate. So I'm going to walk you through some of the insights that we've been finding from the monitoring that we've been doing across the US right now. If we move on to the next slide, I'm going to start with some search traffic data. Now, there's a few reasons why we find search traffic data particularly useful when we're tracking these subject matters. It's an unmoderated space, essentially. Google doesn't ban any searches. You can enter anything you'd like into Google. And more often than not, you're presented with what you're looking for, even if it's violent content. But secondly, it's non-performative. So it's not like social media. It's not like our posts on Facebook or Twitter, where users are choosing to make a statement in a post to all of their friends and their networks. I think many of us tell our deepest, darkest secrets to Google. So it's actually a particularly useful source when we're monitoring extremism and hate. Last year in the US, just for context, we tracked nearly 1 million attempts to access content affiliated with white supremacist and hate groups. And that's across the United States, and that's in 2019 alone. And then at the start of this year with the pandemic, we tracked a 37% increase in attempts to access this sort of content on search. So we know that this is a space, it's a platform that's really used by people who might be at risk and might be engaging with this stuff. Now, over the past few months, we've been specifically tracking attempts to access disinformation, conspiracy theories, and violent content related to the election. So what you're seeing here is a map where we visualize searches for this particular content across the US. This is data from October, and it's weighted by population. So red indicates higher searches for this content per capita, and yellow is lower searches per capita. I'll whiz through this quickly, but Oregon, you can see Oregon near the top there. Oregon has been consistently in the top 3 states for engagement with white supremacist content over the past few years. And as you can see, when it comes to disinformation and violent content related to the election, it's also near the top. That high volume in the run-up to the election in Oregon was really driven by searches for particular armed groups. And then in Kansas, the high number of searches there have been specifically for a number of resources around developing weapons and in particular explosives. I might just flip to the next slide and move on. We're going to stick with search traffic here again. So the last slide, I showed data from the month of October. Here, I wanted to show you what we're seeing on a day-by-day basis in the run-up and through the election. So this chart shows day by day a breakdown of the kinds of election-related disinformation or violent content that's being searched for on Google across the US. Now, we tend to see engagement online as very responsive to activities that take place in the real world. So not on this chart, but in the beginning of October, we saw searches for armed groups peak, and that was largely the tail effect of President Trump's comments on the Proud Boys in the presidential debate. And I should clarify here that this data here doesn't include searches just for Proud Boys on its own. We would have seen off-the-chart searches for that, obviously, as the general public was trying to wrap their heads around who that was. What we've tracked here is specifically people searching for things like Proud Boys membership, Proud Boys t-shirts, indicating some sort of interest in engaging with them. And as you can see on this chart, in the days surrounding the election, we saw a notable increase in targeted violence searches. So those are searches about violence against political leaders, things like how to kill Donald Trump, how to kill Joe Biden, and variations of these. I should note, we've seen these searches across the entire political spectrum, so violent intent against Republican and Democratic politicians alike. But notably, over the past weekend, as you can see on the chart, when Joe Biden was announced as our president-elect, we saw a spike in searches for content related to both conspiracy theories and armed groups. If we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly run through some state-by-state data. So we did some deep dives into particular states. This is just one example related to Wisconsin. There were some fears around political unrest there, so we scanned a whole range of platforms: 4chan, 8kun, Parler, Gab, Reddit. We were looking for election-related discussions in a Wisconsin context between several weeks in October and November. And then we filtered specifically for posts that contained words alluding to violence, so words like attack, kill, or bomb. And as you can see here, we identified a small undercurrent of discussions labeled violent, which are in this chart. And you can see the relative proportions here. It is really a small proportion of the engagement on these platforms that was really violent in intent. And we did another deep dive in Georgia. It's not on this particular slide. And we did find lots of groups talking online about getting armed. But important to mention that when we benchmarked this against the general public conversations in Georgia in the run-up to the election, the general populace wasn't tuned into this. The general public before election day was really talking about things like the lines being long and how they were going to get away from work to vote. So the good news is, in a state like Georgia, voters were more concerned about voting, about actually getting out and voting, rather than being concerned about violence. And that's a good thing, that these sorts of conversations are really limited to certain platforms and in limited quantity. If we move on to the next slide, Many of you will be aware of what's been called the Trump train caravans. In Texas, a Biden-Harris campaign bus was surrounded by Trump supporters in trucks, and that's happened in a few other states. These sorts of incidences were really widely celebrated in far-right spaces online. And when you look at the general volume of violent threats and violence inciting posts, you can see that violent discourse on those platforms tends to match spikes in discussion related to real-world events which are aggressive or violent in nature. This is Twitter data that demonstrates that. So again, the intersection between the online and offline, the two are in sync. And if we move to the next slide, just a final point here that I wanted to share, which is that we're seeing far-right groups increasingly using coded language to discuss violence. So not all of their language is as clear-cut as those of us who are tracking it might hope. There's a new trend amongst the far-right, specifically on 4chan, of adding the words "in Minecraft" to violent threats. And Minecraft, many of you may know, is a relatively popular video game. And by adding the words "in Minecraft" to a violent threat, it allows them deniability. So these sorts of trends are things we're tracking closely to ensure that we get a better sense of how violent conversations are taking place. Now, I'm just going to wrap up quickly with a few messages on our overall assessment of violent discourse online in the run-up and through the elections. Our general observation was that online there was widespread anticipation and just this sense of inevitability that there will be violence. And certainly we did see some armed groups and far-right movements organizing online, to organize poll watching operations, which were expected to be armed. But in monitoring these groups over the last several months now, not many people seem eager to commit violence. Everyone seems to be getting prepared for it. The vast majority of people talking about violence stated that they would only respond to violence rather than incite it themselves. But the real challenge here is that the threshold for reactive violence is very low, and it will continue to be low through the post-election period. Political tensions are high, and we know far-right audiences are really reactive to perceived threats and increasingly to perceived fraud. I might just end with a point of hope. I mentioned earlier that Moonshot does run campaigns, and we've been running campaigns across the US for the last several years to respond to violence. And I might just say that, we find in moments like this, when audiences are engaging with harmful content, the messaging that seems to work with these audiences are messages that aim to de-escalate people from violence, asking them to pause and reflect on their choices, telling them their choices matter, and even appealing to their ties to their immediate neighbors and the people that they loved, their loved ones. We tend to find that kind of messaging more effective than purely ideological messaging aiming to counter their ideology or prove them wrong, which I know is it's an instinct for those of us that want to counter disinformation. So we'll continue to do our best to try and respond to these audiences online, but just wanted to leave you with a message of hope at the end.
Thank you so much for that, Vidya, and thank you all three of you for those introductions, and really I think captured some of the ways that data is informing this discussion in ways that we hadn't seen in the past. I'm reminded to let people know if you want to ask questions, please submit your questions in the chat on the right, in the chat box there. So if I could just start with a sort of a broad question. And not to make an inappropriate sports analogy, but I do remember several years ago, whether it was baseball or basketball, there was this sort of concept of sabermetrics, of bringing in data into the sporting world to make it more efficient, which literally had an impact on the way people were hired, the type of game that it was. And I mention this only because, are we, in a very broad sense, can you talk about the way that collecting data in this way, the availability of data that wasn't around before, how is that fundamentally changing the understanding of extremism and then providing an opportunity to combat it in a way that we didn't have before? Like, how have you seen that play out? Why don't we start again with Shannon and then move down the line?
Sure. Thanks, Oren. I mean, I think I'll be interested to hear how, Hampton and Vidya, who work a lot more with kind of data coming from the online space and the technological ability to kind of pull from these different channels, answer this question. For us, because BDI really starts from kind of how do we get this information in the hands of decision makers and communities. One of the reasons we partnered with ACLID is because it's fully transparent data. So they're coding decisions and how they're presenting the description of political violence is something that people can engage with directly. And I think that does speak to kind of the big data future as well, is that people are going to only trust the things that they feel like there's enough transparency in as well, and understand the source and the decisions behind it. So, ACLID has a publicly downloadable data set, and because it's public in that way and the coding is clear, we're also able to combine it with some of these online tracking and location data and combine it with other sources. So for us, I think the power is both in that it's in the transparency, the ability to combine, but then ultimately in getting it in the hands of folks in different ways. So we do that with some online mapping tools that also bring in technology. But I think as much as possible, driving people to that local level where even though they're seeing all this data and the Moneyball approach, like here's the true statistic, how do you contextualize that in your local community? How do you make sure that it's linked to the details at that level?
And Shannon, I noticed that in your work particularly, I felt like we were able to see how prioritization came into play, right? If you're able to say, this is what we're seeing in a specific county, it's a resource game often. And so that was really important in terms of efficiency. Hampton, how about sort of your perspective on how this has sort of improved the way people approach the issue of extremism?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strengths of this data is that it makes things a little bit more undeniable. When we've got big data projects that are really diving into the reality, it becomes more difficult to push back against the things that we're observing in that data and the sort of causal linkages that we're like attempting to describe. I will say one of the sort of difficulties we find, and that I find specifically about a lot of militia groups, is that the data that I'm able to collect is only just a part of the picture. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on out of what I'm able to track. And so we're just kind of trying to use the traceable data to like project what actually probably is the picture. So the way that I sort of frame it is like there's maybe like 10 or 15% when it comes to militias that maybe makes it into sort of the public eye. Like these are the big things where people show up at protests, where they're announcing publicly their militia, or where there's a city council meeting where the militia shows up and says, we would demand to be recognized, all that kind of stuff. The stuff that I'm able to get to is like maybe at its deepest 40% of the way down this iceberg. And then there's a 60% of stuff that goes on that I'm unable to track. And so there's a lot of stuff that we can get out of these big data projects that I think is really crucial, but we're like a long way out from really, really being able to dive into the full picture over the closest we've been in a long time, I'd say.
Thanks. Vidya?
Yeah, and in full agreement with everything that the others have said. For us, in our responses and trying to reach these audiences online, data is allowing us to get really local and really personal in our responses. So if, I mentioned some of the state-by-state findings, and we even can go down to the county level. If we know in a specific county in Illinois, there are lots of internet users that are engaging with a specific conspiracy theory, then that can help not only us, but also local authorities drive their local programming and ensure they're being responsive and giving the right rebuttals that they need to be giving at the local level. But it also helps us ensure that we're not building our programs on the basis of any assumptions. And one of the points that the examples I usually come back to on this is around the gender of people who are engaging with this content online. A lot of counter programming and programming to deal even with disinformation, not just kind of white supremacy or militia movements, is built on the premise that we're probably dealing with largely male movements. Now, we tend to find, not only in the US, but also internationally, with audiences engaging this sort of extremist content, they tend to be on average around a quarter female, the audience engaging with this. So again, this sort of data can allow us to make sure our programming is really tailored, really personalized, and not driven by assumptions, but by evidence.
You mentioned also earlier that there was a sort of limited quantity of sort of support for violence, maybe more limited than people who are just sort of reading the newspapers would have thought, considering there was so much of a focus put on what could go wrong. Was there anything else, Vidya, starting with you, that you found in this sort of lead up to the election, looking at what is being discussed that was either surprising or provided insight into these movements that maybe you didn't have before because there wasn't this election period?
I think one of the worrying trends we've been seeing is just the mixing and merging of a whole range of conspiracy theories, ideologies, which were once previously distinct and which are now being increasingly pumped out by a range of different movements that wouldn't have necessarily partnered with one another before. And I think that's likely to increase. We're seeing, we're dealing with multiple different crises at the moment, both in the United States and globally, including the pandemic, including the response to the election. And now with the news of the vaccine, we've even been tracking this week how some of the same groups that are pushing election-oriented conspiracy theories are now latching on to the announcement about the potential vaccine. So I think this is going to remain a challenge through the new year. And this is certainly something new for us. We've been tracking and engaging with these groups over the last 4 years, but the blending of their ideologies is a really difficult thing for us to meet and challenge.
Hampton, can you define sort of the militias that you're talking about, that you're tracking, and how that, Vidya was just saying how it's, these things are sort of crossing over and ideologies. Well, there's some people who may look and feel like militias, but maybe they're not quite. So how do you sort of approach that in terms of definitional?
Yeah, you'd think for somebody who runs a blog called Militia Watch that there'd be a really easy, clear definition for militia, but I don't think it's fully the case. I think the sort of working definition that I usually use is there are 3 things that I look for with like armed right-wing movements. Which is I look for a strategy. They have some sort of political goal, some sort of endpoint that they're aiming towards. They have a schedule. They have some sort of, consistency. They're like meeting, once a month, or they have planned events in the future. And then finally, they have a structure. So this can be like highly hierarchical. It can be just the way that they sort of organize themselves. So those 3 things are really crucial for identifying groups that I'm looking at. And yeah, I think Vidya is like right on about the crossover stuff happening right now among groups that I'm tracking. Groups that had been pushing really hard for we're like a moderate force, like that kind of stuff, are now engaging in increasingly sort of plugging like boogaloo aesthetics or like Proud Boy like modalities into networks that had been a little bit shy to that kind of imagery.
Thanks, Hampton. Shannon, back to you. You had mentioned, and obviously we have been working with BDI and yourself at ADL in terms of providing information to those who can make the most use of it, right? I mean, all this sort of data gathering and analysis is good, but it's most useful when you can actually deploy it to have people get prepared. Have you felt that there's been, sort of in your experience, this election, a real openness to this data and sort of discussion about, all right, moving forward, how are we going to make use of these insights into these issues? Do you feel like people are embracing what you're providing, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question, Oren. I would say when we first started advocating for specific political violence data ahead of this election, we were making the case that it was necessary. But there was definitely a shift in the summer from having to make the case it was necessary to what do you have? Why don't you have that already? And like, how can we engage? As you pointed out, that we often try and get down to that county level or the state level engagement, and there you see variety as well. So for folks who are already thinking about or have seen in their communities armed actors who they're concerned about, they're glad to understand where they fit in relation to other areas if they feel like they're at higher risk, and be directly linked to things they can do about it. I know, Oren, you and I worked, or ADL works as well with Georgetown ICAP, who produced a lot of fact sheets that gave people really concrete actions they could take if they saw unlawful intimidation around the polling places. And I think that was really powerful for people who are already convinced. I also think that the fact we were able to bring in this new type of data and get it ready for when people were more concerned about this threat ahead of the election also allowed us to pivot and say, well, even though this is the more dominant narrative, just as Vidya highlighted, it's still an undercurrent, and the vast majority of engagement has been peaceful. The big story of the period leading up through the summer is about peaceful demonstration and success of protecting all of our, constitutional rights. So I think it was, for us, the U.S. Crisis Monitor was only able to start in May, but we're also really excited looking forward to other elections. This could be a baseline for us to understand what were the trends leading into this one. But then as we look forward to the midterm, to the next presidential election, how will those compare to what we saw this year?
That's a huge point about sort of this baseline, right? Because when you have this baseline, that's where then sort of the next set of data, if you will, is even more useful because you have something to compare it. And Vidya, I know that you all have done such incredible work on that, especially with regard to white supremacy, sort of year over year data and looking at sort of responses to events. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, yeah, we've been monitoring some data sources over the last 3 or 4 years, and in particular search data. We have a data set from the United States on attempts to access white supremacist content on search engines. And I'm going to start with a worrying trend and end with a positive point here, because I don't want to leave everyone with just worries. A worrying trend is we have seen year on year in the US that the volume of engagement has grown. And in particular, in the aftermath of attacks, in every case, after a violent attack, we see spikes in engagement. So after El Paso, it was a 54% spike. If I go back in time, after the 2018 Pittsburgh attack, it was a 92% increase. After Charlottesville in 2017, it was a 400% increase. And what's worrying is that we don't often return back to normal levels of engagement afterwards. The baseline usually resets year on year following those different sets of attacks. Now, just a kind of hopeful counterpoint to that is when we've been running campaigns during those periods, we also see an increase in clicks on our alternative content, our safer content that we're offering. So after El Paso, for example, we saw a 59% increase in clicks on our safer content that we were offering audiences who might be violent. So there is a kind of opportunity there for us to be responsive, especially in the immediate aftermath of crises. And I mentioned earlier, we're in the midst of several crises at the moment. So this probably isn't going to go away for the next few months. And there's just a need for us to be highly responsive, especially in the online space.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for always sort of remembering to sort of put in opportunities and hope into the discussion. These can obviously be downers in terms of discussion, and I think it's super important. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because we have been getting a healthy amount of questions. So we don't have to call it like a speed round, but I'll just throw out a couple here, and we'll see where we can go. Now I'm going to direct this to the person who's being asked, but please, for the other two, please feel free to jump in if you have something else to add to this question. So the first one is for Hampton. You mentioned that 60% that you're unable to track a function of being a member or targeted group. If that's the reason, is that the reason, and what are the reasons for only getting 60%, I think, deep into understanding the militia is what I recall you said.
Yeah. So the sort of the deepest that I can get down on the iceberg of militia activity is mostly about the sort of communications that they have, the intergroup communications. That other 60-70% or so down that I can't get is sort of more traditional communication. So this is between individuals in person, it's their text messages, it's their calls, it's WhatsApp group chats, it's things that no researcher could conceivably actually get to. There's a lot of organizing that happens offline with militia groups. The internet and social media has allowed for more organizing across greater distances, but most militia groups rely on at least some sort of substantial physical organizing, whether that's training in person, doing sort of ideological work in person, responding to counter protests, which is something that I can track, but a lot of the sort of training, a lot of the recruitment, a lot of the individual communications, that's stuff that I can't get proof enough to include in data oftentimes.
Got it. Thank you. Next question is for Shannon. how do organizers or activists get access to some of the data that you've been mentioning?
Sure. So one of the ways I mentioned is going to the U.S. Crisis Monitor website itself to download the raw data and some of the summaries and to see the codebook there. We also have what we call an ecosystem map on our website, bridgingdivides.princeton.edu, which combines that event level data together with other civil society groups that might be interested and able to engage in actually addressing some of the issues you'd see at your local level. And I think one of the powerful things we've been able to do ahead of this election is when there is interest either from researchers or some of those civil society groups in kind of helping to answer a particular question they have about trends that they see anecdotally, we've been able to work with them to integrate their own kind of observations and data together with some of that event type data and other resources. Again, in many cases, actually pulling in some of the ADL heat map data, which is great in terms of looking back much longer, especially at the types of political violence that affects targeted groups, which isn't always captured in the U.S. Crisis Monitor political data. So I think there's a lot that we sort of make sure to do to present this publicly when possible, but when it's also more sensitive, are really committed to supporting those mission-driven organizations and understanding these issues.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, next question for Vidya. Can you give any examples of what you regard moderately effective intervention with an online extremist member forum? My sense is people are interested in sort of a story where there's sort of success there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mentioned earlier some of the messages that we're finding most effective with these audiences, in particular for audiences that are indicating through their search behaviors that they are interested in engaging in some form of violence. We've found content that asks them to reflect on their choices and telling them that every choice they make matters. Pause, think for a moment, think about the people you love. We found that to be incredibly effective with those audiences, and we've actually had in our prior campaigns in 2019, we had very high click-through rates from audiences that were on the more extreme end of the spectrum. Now, there's a number of organizations out there that are starting to attempt to reach audiences online and get them into offline programming. There's an organization called Life After Hate that many of you might be aware of, set up by former extremists, former white supremacists in particular, aiming to pull people out of white supremacist movements. And they've recently partnered with a number of organizations, myself, Moonshot included, but also with Facebook and with some of the tech companies to attempt to try and signpost their services to these audiences. And I believe there's initial results which will be released from those programs in the months to come. But those are the sorts of initiatives that we should be looking at to really try and find those success stories in longer term engagement with these audiences beyond just showing them a piece of content online, trying to actually work with them in the long run. And we should all stay tuned and look for the evaluation of those initiatives.
Thanks. When sort of being familiar with all the data that you all have and have built, for an organization like ADL and for a team that I work with that, is basically focused on trying to prevent extremists from doing bad things or, educating the public so that we're mitigating in some way these threats. The same with all of you, sort of salivating over this data. I mean, it is a diverse set of data. And I guess my question, this is not from others, we'll go back to the questions from the crowd, but like, how do we like bring in all this data together in the most effective way? Because it's not totally separate, right? But it's also not totally combined yet. And I feel like there's strength in bringing this data more closely. So any thoughts on how that might happen? Is that working in some places? Are there sort of initiatives to do that already?
Sure. I can jump in some. I think, Orin, you're familiar with some of the work we were able to tackle ahead of the election in terms of first in modeling, and you've heard me reference a couple times ADL's data, but we brought in over a dozen different open source data sources and we're kind of looking with more academic approaches to how that could give us a picture of higher risk areas. And I think there's real promise in doing that collaboratively with the folks who produce that data and from different academic perspectives going into future elections. I also think that the real focus on and a renewed interest in armed actors and unlawful paramilitary that we've talked a lot about today has brought a lot of different researchers and folks who are looking at these issues together ahead of the election in a real moment of urgency. So we've definitely, as from BDI, we're not the sort of in the weeds militia researcher folks, but we definitely have an idea of how to get that information to people. So helping to kind of facilitate those discussions. So when someone comes to us with a new idea, bringing them into, well, these people are doing that too, and they have a piece of that data, and how can we bring that all together, especially ahead of a high tension moment like an election. But I think, Oren, your idea of how can we do that in a more steady state as well is a great one, and one we want to keep working
on. Other thoughts? If not, maybe let me ask the question in sort of reverse. What's sort of the biggest challenges, maybe for Hampton and Vidya, what are the biggest challenges in collecting this data? Is it the sort of access to platforms? Is it how language is becoming, a little bit sort of that gray area where is it really an extremist who says this? Is the Overton window moved so much that we don't even know? Is it the reliability of that data? Can you talk a little bit about those challenges that you face as you're trying to put data together that at the end of the day you hope is actionable, right? Let me start with you, Vidya.
Sure. Oh, never mind. Go for it.
Sure, happy to start and then go over to Hampton. I mean, the data that we're gathering is data that's for the large part in the public domain. It's data that we don't gather in partnership with the tech companies. We just use creative methods, access their APIs, and try and get our hands on any data which seems like it'll be useful for us to monitor these groups. That does come with its own challenges. The tech companies are sometimes more open to those sorts of, to researchers and to entities like ours accessing that data, and sometimes more difficult or more closed. So we have to get a bit creative to make sure that we can do this sort of monitoring at scale. I guess the main methodological challenge beyond data collection is really judging intent. When we're tracking these movements, what we tend to do is we have databases of risk indicators, so the types of keywords, phrases, links that get shared by these groups, the music they're listening to, and some of those indicators are really clear-cut. A lot of those indicators are not as clear-cut, and more often than not, we see people, using language which indicates intent who have no intent to actually carry out violence. If we reported every single incidence of someone writing online that they had an interest in carrying out an act of violence, then we would think that violence would be off the charts in America, and that's just not the case. So the main methodological challenge for us moving forward is how do we actually judge intent? How do we actually gauge risk of real world violence from the conversations that are taking place online?
Yeah. Just a quick response to the tail end of that. So one of the things that I do try and track is the sort of temperature of a lot of spaces. So if threats of violence are becoming more permissible, one of the things that I look for in a lot of sort of militia spaces is how often those spaces are becoming spaces of normalization of this type of language, which is something that I've seen in some cases correspond with like action in real space, but I mean, totally. A lot of the folks that I track talk a lot of big game, and then often sort of it's relegated to like chat rooms and stuff. So it's important not to take that on its own as indication of potential for violence. But I think back to the original question, a lot of my research workflow at the beginning of the year involved looking at like Facebook there were militias all over Facebook. It was really easy to find the groups. A lot of them were public. They had public pages where they were posting stuff. With tech companies starting to crack down on this content, it has reduced their sort of organizational capacity. There's been places where a planned event has been canceled because that information stream has gone away. Groups are moving to other platforms, and so researchers like myself have to just be scrappy and figure out where they've gone and where they're organizing, where they're talking. But it has led to groups not being able to organize as easily, and has led to membership in a lot of these groups being cut off because, if I'm, Johnny Militia and I'm in like my state militia Facebook group and I haven't been on the page in like 2 weeks and then Facebook deletes the page, I don't necessarily know where to look to rejoin my militia. Maybe I Google it and can find it, but for the most part, like, you have to have a direct connection, a direct information connection in order to find where your militia group has gone. And that could be through text message, it could be through group chats, it could be through Zello, like these alternate channels. But the fact that that is something that these groups have to pursue means that the organizational capacity drops down, at least in the short to moderate term.
That's very interesting, because I mean, some of the questions we're getting here, and also in more broadly, is a concern that these groups are moving to Parler or Gab, right, or some of these alternative or other platforms. And if I'm understanding you, Hampton, you're saying like that could be an issue down the line, but in the short term, it makes the organizing more different, and so that's why it's worthwhile. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, I'll find them if they go to another site. I'll find them. Like, I'll find their new website. I'll find their new channel on Gab. I'll find them on MeWe. I'll find them wherever they go. And that sort of extra work is worth the demobilizing effect that being deplatformed from these places has. Like, it does make my work harder, of course. Like, I can't just log into Facebook and look at content, but it makes their work a lot harder, because have been doing this for a while, tracking where they're landing. And if I'm having difficulty finding where they're landing, imagine, the usual militia member having to go through that same process, who isn't accustomed to sort of tracking down where militia pages are popping up. Got it.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and part of this is sort of the what now, and I think we've done a great job sort of articulating where we've been, how we've got here. We're not asking for predictions. Hampton reminded me early on before, we shouldn't be in the prediction business, which I think is important. But I do think people are concerned or want to know more. This is a very unique time, right? There is a president and vice president elect, and yet it's not completely clear what's happening. Is this going to animate those folks who we've all been talking about now for 56 minutes? So in maybe like with a minute each, sort of where do you see this heading? Whether it's to let sort of the viewers get a sense of what's next, without, I'm not asking you to totally predict the future. Why don't we start with Shannon here?
Sure. I think you're right. Or, I mean, as I mentioned briefly in my presentation, we are still in the election period. And so just acknowledging that this is an ongoing process, and, as I said, highlighting where folks are standing up for the integrity of the election, standing up for democracy, and doing so in a way that really draws on a lot of the resources and research we've talked about here. We talked about this data informing folks who have been working on de-escalation, and that's what we're seeing broadly. And I think it's what we have to continue to see, because as we track potential incitement opportunities for bad actors to use just this heightened period of tension and uncertainty to their advantage, that action will continue to be needed. And I think it can lay the foundation for what could be longer term reconciliation once the full election process has continued. So, not offering predictions, but I think as others have done, suggesting that there's a ray of hope in what we have seen from leaders from the local to the national level, enforcing that what we want to see through this election process is reducing those threats, reducing the chance for those bad actors to incite violence, whether it's in an individual case or broader.
Thank you. And Hampton.
Yeah, I mean, I think, harping on this hope point, if you had asked me like 3 years ago if I thought that there would be as much attention on the folks that I'm looking at, I would have said absolutely not based on previously. But there is so much media investigation. There are so many resources being poured into, like counter militia, counter right-wing paramilitarism, investigating, demobilizing, all these things that I don't think were there several years ago when they were just as needed. So it's great. I mean, I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person doing militia work, but I feel like the normal public is more concerned about this stuff than they were previously, and I am hoping that will correlate with like a continuing interest in demobilizing and demilitarizing some of this stuff.
Great, Lydia.
Yeah, and I'll just echo some of the other points made by Shannon and Hampton. I mentioned in my presentation that in monitoring these groups, not many people seem eager to actually commit violence. Everyone's getting prepared for it and is anticipating it, but not many people are eager to actually go out and carry out violence. But obviously, the threshold for that sort of reactive violence is very low. We need to be, wary. We need to be keeping an eye out. But to echo Shannon, the election's not over, but also once the election is over, the people who are posting this content online won't disappear. So they might stop posting it. We might see a decrease in engagement online, but they'll still exist. Those tensions will still exist. The harm of the disinformation that has spread during the election period, and even the effect of the militias that Hampton mentioned, that will still have had its impact on significant audiences across the US. So we need to make sure that not only once the election is actually over, that we're continuing that positive community engagement that's going to be needed to really heal America once and help us move forward from this. And I mentioned earlier that every piece of harmful online content is an opportunity. We can find those users that are engaging it, we can reach them and try and start that healing process.
So my hope is that not just that this data is being collected, that it's being leveraged, but it's people like you three are taking it seriously and trying to have the most possible impact with that information. So I really appreciate all three of you making the time. Hampton, Shannon, Vidya. I think people have learned a lot more about some of the ins and outs of this. And I personally look forward to ongoing partnerships with all of you. I think, again, the hope is having partners to work with in pushing back against hate. So for everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. There'll be links to this session shared after this call, and everybody be well in the short term and in the long term. Thanks, all.